Okay guys, let's move on to chapter 1 in our HILLOCKS text, The Problem. And I titled this chat, Murder, She Wrote, after the TV show, which I'm sure none of you are old enough to remember. And anyway, it was about this old lady, a little busybody, and she was like a writer in Maine. And everywhere she went, somebody died, which would give me a complex, but it gave her a TV show. Anyway, in this chapter, HILLOCKS uses murder mysteries. And they're pretty cool, and they're fun to figure out, yada yada. In these cases, the problem is a body. Now, the art of teaching is your thinking about this model of his using other approaches. How can you get students to investigate questions beyond who killed Miss White with the rope in the conservatory? How do you create lessons that ask them to investigate problems and arrive at arguments or conclusions about who done it or what happened? You've seen this slide already someplace else, or I've talked about it, and it's my subject, topic, question, answer slide, which is the way to get to a thesis, the answer being the thesis. And a murder mystery is all about a question, right? Who done it? And because any meaning-making activity is, in my mind, the answer to a question, HILLOCKS' approach is A-OK. It is not Poe with a flashlight. It is meaningful fun. So let's have some fun with it. If someone were to ask me, Jerry, what is the biggest issue you see with student writing at all levels, undergraduates, master's students, doctoral candidates, I would say that HILLOCKS sums it up for us on page 15 when he writes, quote, writing that does not attend to evidence or show how the evidence relates to claims, end quote. That is so important. Students think they can make an assertion and throw out some quotation from some crappy online source and that their work is done. It's the hardest thing to teach, warrant and backing, and that's why we're going to give it a lot of attention. As you can see in chapter 1, HILLOCKS thinks that murder mysteries serve as an entree to problem solving. And he uses his mini-mysteries to teach students the strategies for making arguments, or as I say, making meaning. On page 16, he lists those strategies, all built around making claims and developing warrants, and they're reproduced here next to Colonel Mustard. I like the murder mystery. In fact, a few days after Christmas, I was listening to NPR, driving home from King Super or something, and there was this discussion about 1-minute science mysteries. In this case, it was about a smoke detector. And of course, I began thinking about, how might we use these in the same way HILLOCKS uses his murder mystery of Queenie and Arthur? And it's interesting, right? Because we talked in class, or we will talk in class, about identifying students' interests and trying to use those to lure students to literacy. Well, if you have some crazy math geek who actually likes that shit, then math mysteries might work, and they do exist. If you got somebody who likes to dissect, like fetal pigs or whatever they dissect in biology class, and then he'll become a future mass murderer a la Jeffrey Dahmer, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, if they like science, you can give them the science mysteries. And if you just have somebody who likes, the mystery thing, give them 1-minute mysteries. I have books on these. Anyway, the point is that there's a link on, there's a link here, and there's also a link under course materials to the NPR show, and you can either listen or read the transcript. But think about how you might craft that smoke detector mystery into the same thing that HILLOCKS is trying to do. And think about how cool this would be to share with a science person. I actually shared it with some people in science ed, and they were all over it. And I'm like, why don't you guys know this stuff? But that's another whole story too. You get me? I'm going off on such a tangent. Anyway, I ordered the book of science mysteries, and I have some 1-minute mysteries, and we're going to take a look at what's inside in class. Like many compositionists, and that is people who teach composition as opposed to rhetorician who are all into the theory stuff, I advocate a writing process that follows the Canons of Rhetoric identified by Aristotle, because I love a man in a toga. Invention, disposition, and style. The last two, memory and delivery, are particularly relevant to speech. And of course, remember, Aristotle was talking about spoken argument, not written argument. So we'll talk about all of these during the semester, but not so much memory and delivery. And HILLOCKS shares with you some invention or pre-writing examples in this chapter. They're informal, it's not a lot of direct instruction, but the discussion, the question and answer, and the graphic organizers of evidence, rule, and conclusion are all parts of invention strategies. And I think invention is maybe one of the least taught and most important aspects of getting off on the right foot with any kind of meaning-making assignment. Please don't be Bill O'Reilly, but I put it up here because I know I spew so much left-leaning stuff that I wanted to show that I could be, you know, fair and unbiased or whatever. And that class was a no-spin zone. Not quite. Anyway, if you look on page 28, the questions HILLOCKS uses to elicit information make up my favorite invention strategy, the 5 W's and H, aka the journalist question. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Answering these questions helps a rhetor gather information. That said, it's easy to skim the surface with these questions, so heed HILLOCKS' advice in all things. We want to move to more complex and complicated thinking, the 2 C's. We might ask, who is in the house? There's a who question. But we also might ask, who benefits from Arthur's death? Or we might ask, who are his enemies? So we move from the surface level who question to one that digs a little bit more deeply into the situation. Now for this mystery, which is pretty self-evident, Queenie done it. If I'd hang her immediately. Anyway, for this mystery, these questions might be unnecessary. You don't need to dig much deeper. I ask students to come up with multiple questions for each of the 5 W's and H when I use this as an invention strategy. Sometimes it's a stretch, and experienced writers know when that's the case, and they should skip one of the W's or the H. There's no where involved in this situation, a writer might say, so I'm not even going to do the where. But I try to get students to stretch as much as they can. We're working with neophytes, we're working with beginning writers, so let's stretch their rhetor muscles. Anyway. The end of invention is the thesis. After you've done all your invention, or after you've done your pre-writing, another word for invention, you end up with a thesis. And there are a zillion euphemisms for thesis. Argument, point, organizing idea, yada yada. I happen to like the implications of organizing idea because it is what a thesis should do, organize. But I tend to use working thesis to indicate that until the final draft, the thesis might be in flux. Beth Neiman's book, Teaching Students to Write, is the text I've used for the last couple years, until the HILLOCKS book showed up on my desk. And there are parts of Teaching Students to Write that I think are actually better, and I'll share those with you. I'll make a PDF of the chapters. One of the elements of hers that I have adapted has to do with the working thesis. And we've already talked about the although clause, and that's what comes from Neiman's text. She introduced me to the idea of the although clause. The because clause is something I learned when I was a graduate student teaching freshman composition many, many, many years ago. So anyway, let's look at what HILLOCKS and his kids come up with on page 29. They conclude, we believe Queenie is not telling the truth. The evidence does not support what she says happens. And with that, HILLOCKS asks the students to come up with 5 pieces of evidence or data and the attendant warrants. Here's the way I would cast that working thesis. Although we arrived after Arthur's death, we believe Queenie is a lying Queenie is lying about the events because the glass that is still in his hand is not broken. There is no evidence that anything in the way of his fall was disturbed, and his body has landed facing up. Okay? Now remember, I like the term organizing idea, and here's why. This version of the thesis, not unlike what HILLOCKS has on page 29, tells the student what has to be discussed if he or she is going to convince the reader of the viability of what they are arguing, or what he or she is arguing. So the red part is the although clause, right? And it indicates whatever background or context must be included. And as I think we've talked about, it also indicates counter-argument. It's acknowledging that there is another side. And that's always important when you're trying to convince somebody of something. The blue section is the answer to the problem. the conclusion based on evidence, the meaning the rhetor wants to make. Here, it's not about determining who done it, it's determining that Queenie is lying. And the green is the because clause. It presents the evidence. Now in HILLOCKS thesis, this was generalized as the evidence. And in a final report, that might be the term that's used. The evidence proves that Queenie is lying. But if we think about the idea that this thesis helps us organize, then the green section says to the writer, you need to talk about the glass, the fact that nothing was disturbed, and the way the body landed in order to prove your point. The outline of the entire document is implicit in the thesis. And the outline indicates how a rhetor will dispose of the information gathered during invention. Remember, disposition is the second of Aristotle's Canons of Rhetoric. So after invention, after the gathering of information and the building towards a thesis or argument, comes disposition. Part of the process is the idea of how you will dispose of or arrange and organize information. And it's interesting, if you look up disposition, you'll see it's not just one's personality. It's about arranging and organizing. Anyway, the best way to plan is through an outline. It helps you stay organized and it helps you arrange your thoughts. My love of the outline should be apparent. It's the same spirit that leads me to love the lesson plan. Now, reverse outlining is a practice used with writers to help assess their organization. Anyway, whereas outlining is a pre-writing activity, a reverse outline is part of revision. It has students write an outline for their finished paper to make sure that the organization makes sense and all the required elements are present. There's nothing that they've missed and there's nothing extraneous. So here's an assignment for you, and it shows under course materials for this week, and it shows under assignments. I want you to kind of reverse outline HILLOCKS activity, except it's more a reverse lesson plan or learning plan. Day 1 goes from page 16 to 25 in the HILLOCKS book. You are to make a copy of these pages, and in the margins, I want you to note where each element of the learning plan takes place. And if there are elements missing, please insert them. So if you think it's missing a check for understanding, put it in. If you think it's missing a moment for direct instruction, add it in. Just flip the paper over and tell me what you would do. Okay, does that make sense? Now, if there are steps or elements you would change, alter, or whatever, indicate those. For example, here's one that I would do. Given the urban demographic of the class HILLOCKS describes, I might make sure they know what a country club is, because it does indicate the socioeconomic status of the victim. And if you believe, as I do, that Queenie killed him for his money because she's a bimbo gold digger, well, then you want to make sure they understand that he's got money. So, although his little outfit looks like he's wearing an ascot, that's probably enough proof too. Anyway, I'll collect this. So we're done. Hop to it. Go write me a reverse learning plan. And I'll see you in class.